Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Frank Jotzo. I'm with the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the ANU, and on behalf of the ANU Climate Change Institute and the ANU Energy Change Institute, thank you for attending and taking part in tonight's public lecture on net zero, the UK's 2050 emissions target. So there's now widespread recognition, of course, that to deal with climate change, fundamentally, we will need to ultimately move to a net zero emissions world economy. That's a big task, a very big task, and until recently, you wouldn't have found any government really embracing that as something to commit to, but the tide is shifting, and in many jurisdictions we see that now. Australian states and territories have declared net zero emissions targets, typically for around the middle of the century. Various countries are moving towards net zero emissions targets or have already adopted them. And of course, the UK government has announced plans that would commit the country to net zero emissions by 2050. And that announcement, of course, came on the back of a report by the UK government's Committee on Climate Change that recommended just such a net zero target. That's what we're going to hear about and discuss tonight. So that report makes many points that may resonate or perhaps should resonate in Australia, despite the very different starting points, energy and industrial systems. These include the need for long-term strategy on emissions reductions, deep emissions reductions, the rapid reductions in the cost of renewable energy technologies that we've seen, the economic opportunity in the emergence of new industries and the co-benefits in health and for the environment, local environment, the importance of distributional issues and just transition, and of course how to deal with the question of those emissions that remain from the energy industrial system and how to compensate for them through carbon capture and storage. So tonight we have the great privilege of hearing about this from the Vice Chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change, Professor Julia King, the Baroness Brown of Cambridge. Professor King's talk will be followed by a Q&A session. We anticipate that we'll have about 30 minutes for that. And we will use an online tool as well as the traditional way of taking questions. And I think, details behind me. So please turn your mobiles on silent, but don't necessarily turn them off because you might need them for that Q&A determination. After the event, we'll have refreshments from 7:30 to 8. I'd now like to call on Professor Keith Nugent, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor here at the ANU for Research and Innovation, to welcome our esteemed guest and to give you some background. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, as Frank mentioned, my name is Professor Keith Nugent. I am the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation here at the Australian National University, and on behalf of the university, I would very much like to welcome you to our campus. In particular, of course, I would like to welcome tonight's very distinguished speaker, Professor Dame Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, and the Vice Chair of the UK Committee on Climate Change. I would also like to welcome Peter Cook, Professor Peter Cook from the University of Melbourne Centre for Carbon Capture and Storage Research. Now, it gives me great pleasure indeed to welcome you here tonight and to officially open this event. As Australia's national university, we take the national in our name, as the Australian National University, very seriously. We were established some 70 years ago to benefit Australia through the quality of our research, education and contribution to societal transformation. To do this, we have been going through a process of identifying some major issues for our time, and we've been identifying things such as grand challenges. Grand challenges include for example, Indigenous health and wellbeing, a program we're setting up as we speak, but also thinking about what a zero carbon future would look like. So this is part of the research and impact that we want to have as Australia's national university. So tonight, as part of that key concern for the institution, we are highlighting a key issue for all humans on this planet, which is, of course, climate change. To address this challenge, the ANU Climate Change Institute and the ANU Energy Change Institute were established and have been in operation for some time. They are looking for ways to develop cross-campus solutions, so we're looking to cross disciplines to bring different perspectives together to connect connect ANU research with industry, with government, and of course with the broader community. As a result of the way that ANU is taking this approach it's taking to these problems, we probably now have the broadest portfolio of energy research capability, ranging from energy economics, governance, regulation, security, sociology and policy, to the latest scientific and engineering research into new technologies in Australia. We see this breadth of approach, this interdisciplinary approach, as really an important part of our national mission as Australia's national university. And our research on climate change at ANU covers the science of climate change and the effects it has on our biophysical environment. We analyse its impacts on society and societal responses from different perspectives, including economic, legal, sociological and political. We also, of course, look around the world to learn from the experiences of others, to learn from the best people in the world, and to look at new ways of finding innovative solutions to tackle the issue of climate change for the globe. So tonight we do have the immense privilege of hearing from one of the leading experts in this field. So this is an example of bringing in the best and learning from what they have to say. And so it does give me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Baroness Brown has had an extraordinarily distinguished career. She trained as an engineer and also held roles as a senior business leader across a number of well-known organisations and companies, including Rolls-Royce. She served as Vice-Chancellor of Aston University for a decade, and so is aware of the challenges and opportunities of the university sector. In 2006, she was appointed to the UK government to lead the King Review of low-carbon cars. In 2018, she was appointed as Chair of the Carbon Trust, in addition to serving as Deputy Chair of the Committee on Climate Change. So, as you can see from that very brief description, we are incredibly privileged to have Baroness Brown here tonight to share some of her insights into the rationale for the level and timescale of the net zero target, the estimation of costs and the challenges for meeting this ambitious delivery by 2015. Baroness Brown of Cambridge is a 2019 Distinguished Lecturer at the University of Melbourne Centre for Carbon Capture and Storage Research and is in Australia for 2 weeks with support from the Minerals Council of Australia. So please join me in welcoming Baroness Brown.
It's not worked. Oh well. Can I turn on your lapel? That's fine.
Well, first of all, everybody, lovely to see you all here, and let me apologise for being a bit late. We had a bit of a misunderstanding about the start time, but it's great that you've all stayed, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to you. I'm the Vice Chair of the Committee on Climate Change, and the Committee on Climate Change in the UK was made a statutory body by the Climate Change Act just over 10 years ago. And we have a number of very important roles. We're a group of, you might call us technocrats, we're a group of of experts in climate change, engineering, economics. We have a forester. There are 8 of us in total. So we're all technical experts, and the biggest part of our role is actually to recommend to the UK Parliament the levels of the 5 yearly carbon budgets. So these are like money budgets, only they're how much CO2 we can emit in 5-year periods. And we have to do those by modelling the economy and thinking about the new technologies that are coming along and looking at scenarios to get us from where we are to on our path that's specified by the Climate Change Act. And when it was passed in 2008, that path was that we had to get to an 80% reduction on 1990 emissions, the Kyoto baseline, an 80% reduction by 2050. So every 5 years, we recommend to the government a new carbon budget. We've currently got carbon budgets out to 2032. We're currently working on what's called the 6th carbon budget, which will take us out to 2037, and that hopefully will be legislated next year. And then every year, also in the Act, we get to look at how the government is doing in terms of putting the policies in place that will be needed to deliver the carbon budgets, to take us down on our emissions reduction path. And essentially we get to mark the government's homework and get to say where we're doing well and where they need to try harder. So these are very important roles for us. We actually report to Parliament in these roles, and Parliament spends a long time discussing the reports that we produce, and the opposition usually takes some pleasure in taking the government to task for not working hard enough. However, in the end of last year, after the agreement at Paris and after the IPCC 1.5 degree report, pointing out how much better things would be if we could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century rather than 2 degrees. So you get to keep a few of your corals in the Great Barrier Reef if we can limit it to 1.5. You might lose all of them if we get to 2, sadly. So after that, the government asked us if we would do a report and some analysis to tell them how Britain could get to net zero emissions and when Britain might be able to get to net zero emissions. And we presented that report to Parliament in May this year, and at the end of June, legislation was passed which amended the Climate Change Act, and that legislation changed the target in the Climate Change Act. It just has one line. It changes 80% to 100%. So that was the recommendation of our report, that we could get to net zero emissions by 2050. And that's what I want to tell you about, the rationale for that, and indeed what it actually means in terms of the challenge for the UK. So, why did we choose 2050? Why? Because of the science, because of what was going on globally, because of the role we believe the UK should play. How were we confident that this was achievable? What did we estimate that it would cost? And then just to end up by saying, this is doable, but it is a really big challenge. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with this. This is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. If you look at the Mauna Loa Observatory, if you look at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography website, they actually give you this data every day. And you can see it varies through the seasons, as you might expect, and it's now significantly over 400 parts per million. Well, that's kind of interesting, varying through the year. This is rather more interesting. This is the data going back 800,000 years. And over 800,000 years, it's varied quite a lot. But since industrialization, it's done something in that period it's never done before. So this isn't just a scratch on the slide. This is what we have been doing by burning coal and fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. So it's perhaps not surprising that that's having an impact. And indeed, we can model the impact of the emissions that we're creating. We can model what human-induced warming, what human-induced warming should look like, the green line, and we can compare it with the observations. And yes, not surprisingly, we can see a really good correlation. So there is no question that we are causing global warming from our greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, there are other atmospheric and other processes going alongside that, but the dominant trend of those lines is what we are doing. So the science should be beyond question now. So in the IPCC report, they presented a number of trajectories looking at how we could confidently stay below 2 degrees by the end of the century, and the kind of trajectory in terms of reducing our emissions that we would need to be on if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. And to give ourselves a 50% chance of being below 1.5 degrees, the world's emissions, which have been doing this, probably need to come down on some path like this median red one here, and globally we need to get to net zero by about 2070. So we said to our government, well, as a rich country, we need to get to net zero by 2050. And that's the story I want to tell you about. But just before we get there, it's kind of interesting to look at where our emissions per capita have been going. Because whilst global emissions have been going up, global emissions per capita on average have been sort of chuntering around 7. In the UK, we've been coming down here, so we're now almost respectable. We're at about 7.5. So we can almost claim we don't look too outlandish on a per capita basis. This one is not meant to be a wind-up for you, but just a gentle reminder that that's where you are. And so we do need Australia to continue hurtling down that line as fast as you can, please, because we do need you to come and join us, preferably below the world's average, but certainly down around the world's average as soon as you can. So why did we say to our government we should get there by 2050? Well, first of all, because the commitment that actually our governments made at Paris was about the highest possible ambition, and about the highest possible ambition that was fair and ambitious in the light of national circumstances. And our national circumstances in the UK, and indeed yours here, are that we are rich countries who have benefited hugely from industrialisation and from creating CO2 emissions historically. The UK has the capability to be more ambitious than the world. The very fact we've been able to reduce emissions rapidly since 1990, coming down here, reducing our emissions by 42%, well ahead of the average for the G7, whilst increasing our GDP just above the average of the G7. So we certainly have the capability. We've demonstrated that we can do it, so we should go on doing it. You might argue in Australia you haven't quite demonstrated you can do it yet. Here you are, this is your GDP per capita, and your CO2 emissions have been tracking GDP per capita pretty closely, which is sort of what old-fashioned economic theory would tell you you might expect them to do. However, around 2010, they maybe seem to be just starting to separate, so let's hope that that's a good sign that you're about to move off onto a track that really starts to separate GDP from emissions. We have a good framework for doing it. We've had the Climate Change Act in place for 11 years now. It's still supported quite widely across the House, and it's still supported pretty strongly by the British public. So again, we have the capability and the framework. We also have, we think, a strong moral duty to contribute more. Actually, the 80% in the original Climate Change Act was simply calculated on the basis of an equal per capita emissions in 2050 for everybody in the world, and that left you a figure of about 2 tons each. Most of our cars emit more than that today, so it's not an awful lot, but it was about 2 tons each. That, of course, for a rich country isn't really fair, because the fact we're a rich country is because we've been, in our case, because we were the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and we've been creating large amounts of CO2 emissions ever since then. So we really do owe a bit of a debt to the rest of the world, because although we are only 1% of CO2 emissions now, we're responsible for more like 2 to 3% of historic CO2 emissions. And let's add to that the fact that we are now not a particularly strongly industrial nation, so we import a large number of manufactured goods that other people have made for them, creating CO2 emissions which are accounted in their country. So our carbon footprint is this line up here. Our CO2 emissions from our things we do nationally, the CO2 emissions that are accounted for at Paris is this red line coming down here. And as you can see, the story of our carbon footprint up here is a much less positive one, although it does tell you how good a financial crisis is for reducing emissions. So our consumption emissions look pretty dreadful. There are our production emissions, that's what we account for in Paris, but actually here are our consumption emissions for 2016, and they're something like 40% higher. So we do indeed need to try a bit harder in contributing to global emissions reduction. And then finally, we said to the government, as a rich country, as a country that wants to be seen as taking a leadership role, we can't take a leadership role unless we're prepared to do something rather more ourselves, that we should be doing more so the middle income and the developing countries have a bit longer to bring their populations up to higher standards of living. And so we've been working with University College London on a model that we call our leadership-driven scenarios. And our leadership-driven scenarios that say that leading countries should be, rich countries should be reaching net zero by 2050. Emerging economies should be aiming to peak as soon as they can, but they don't actually have to drive quite so hard for net zero. And developing regions, the lines in sort of grey and in green, whose emissions are already low, they really, if they can come down slowly, they really don't need to be too concerned about 2050, and possibly not even 2070. They can go on with these low level of emissions, hopefully increasing the living standards of their population really for some time towards the end of the century. And so those are the kind of pathways we think the different parts of the globe should be aiming for, and it really does put the onus on us to be getting there by 2050. The other thing that we should be doing is actually taking on board some of the costs of cost-reducing the new low-carbon technologies. And we've done that in the UK very effectively for offshore wind. So we now have about 10 gigawatts of offshore wind on our electricity system. We're aiming for something like 75 to 100 gigawatts by 2050. We have subsidised the cost reduction of that. It's been subsidised by UK electricity consumers because we have an electricity price that's about £45 per megawatt hour. It's the price of essentially gas in a gas turbine plant, which is what most of our core of our electricity system is at the moment. When we first brought wind onto the system, it was costing us about £120 a gigawatt hour. But actually, brilliantly, in the auctions we've just had for people to bring wind resource onto the system in the late 2020s, the auctions that they are offering to bring wind resource onto offshore wind onto the system now at less than £40 per megawatt hour. So that's cheaper than the price of electricity in the UK. So our electricity costs should be coming down in the UK as we move through the 2020s and we bring a lot more wind, offshore wind, onto our system. So in a period of just 5 years, basically, the cost of offshore wind in the UK has reduced by a third. It wouldn't have done that if we hadn't subsidised it, if the government hadn't taken the decision that we had to drive this market and help support the cost reduction of this technology. So this is now a technology that developing and low-income economies can themselves, we hope, apply and benefit from the fact that it is actually now a cheap way to generate electricity. So we think it's appropriate that we take on the costs of cost-reducing some of these technologies, and also that we facilitate the transfer of technology and the development of appropriate institutions in countries that are coming along this path behind us. So fortunately, our government accepted that. Our government does see, our Conservative government does see that taking a leadership role in climate change and reducing CO2 emissions is a good place for it to be. And indeed, we are hosting the COP in 2020. It will be hosted in the north of the United Kingdom, in Scotland, in Glasgow. And that is the COP at which countries are supposed to come bringing along the improvements on their commitments at Paris to reduce emissions. So it's hugely important, since we're hosting it, that we're demonstrating that we're prepared to do that ourselves. So having said there's a really strong imperative for us to do it, having had the government accept that, we also, of course, had to demonstrate that it could be done, and that it could be done at reasonable cost. So let me talk about how can it be done. Whoops. Oh, you've got a preview. This is just to kind of orient you. These are in 2017, this was what made up the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So this little bit at the bottom is electricity generation. This bit is industry, so that's things like steel making, that's things like the ceramics industry, firing of kilns, it'll be the petrochemical industry will be in there. This is heating our buildings, which we use an enormous amount of methane, both in homes and in commercial and office buildings, in gas boilers, basically, to heat the radiators. This is transport, excluding international aviation and shipping. This is agriculture and land use change and forestry, LULUCF. These are waste emissions, these are F-gases, and that's international aviation and shipping. And for comparison, this is Australia's emissions for roughly the same year. And the first thing you notice, of course, is there are less of you, but your emissions are actually not very dissimilar in terms of the level. But you have, as a proportion, something like more than double of your emissions come from your electricity sector. Your direct combustion is somewhat comparable to our heat in buildings, and clearly your transport is comparable to our transport, and those are similar proportions. As you might expect, you have more agricultural emissions than we do. So just to kind of give you a bit of a grounding in terms of when I talk about reducing our emissions, this is what they look like, and power emissions have already come down a lot in the UK. So this is the journey we've been on since 1990, and the success stories over that time really have been the reduction in power emissions. That's this red line here, and that's because of a decision that we would, about just over 10 years ago, that all coal would be taken off our electricity system by 2025. We had a lot of elderly coal-fired power stations at the time, so it wasn't a terribly difficult decision because they were all going to have come to the end of their lives. They were all having problems in terms of various air quality directives, so they will all be gone by 2025. So that's been rapid removal of coal from the system and its replacement with renewables. And the other success really has been waste, and that's been the landfill tax, which stopped all sorts of waste going to landfill, particularly carbon-containing wastes. But as you can see, that's rather petered out, and we need to do something more to keep our waste emissions coming down to zero. But you can see we have some problem areas One of those is transport, like you have a problem that transport emissions are actually now going up in the UK, and buildings. Buildings is a very challenging area for us to reduce our emissions with all of this, this burning of methane. Industry looks like a fantastically good story. I wish I could tell you that that was all sorts of new innovations and energy efficiency in industry. That actually has been the sort of restructuring of UK industry and a lot of deindustrialisation, not caused by climate change or the cost of carbon, simply caused by us being a very high cost place to do manufacturing and just losing that industry to cheaper locations. So there's some little bits of improvement in there, but actually most of that is a change in the industry, not a super low carbon set of industries. These are your emissions. You seem to have got some very positive developments from land use change and forestry giving you negative emissions. You seem to have rather more challenging problems with your transport emissions than we do, and by the looks of it, your electricity emissions are starting to come down, which is, I would have thought, not surprising given how much renewables you now have on your system as well. But clearly you have work to do in some of those key areas. So that momentous change in our legislation, which happened on the 27th of June this year, that said that we were no longer aiming to bring these emissions down to 80% of our 1990 level. We are now committed in law to bringing emissions down to here. That's quite a significantly increased challenge, particularly given that we're sort of here already. So the slope of the curve is going to have to get for us considerably steeper. So we already have a fair amount of policy in place. Some of it's really robust policy. Some of it's just ambitions that the government tells us it has. But if you add up the impact of that, it conceivably gets us down to about 77, close to 80% of reduction on 1990 emissions by 2050. So it involves completely decarbonising these remaining emissions from energy. It involves making a bit of a reduction in our industrial emissions, but we'd end up with quite a few of those. Mostly reducing our building emissions, but ending up with a few left. Mostly reducing our transport emissions. Sadly, not really being able to do very much to tackle our agricultural emissions, and with this persistent lump of emissions from aviation and shipping, which by then will be mainly aviation. And a little bit of negative emissions coming perhaps from some bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the government already has ambitions and some policies to do that. We need more policy implementation if we're going to achieve the 80% reduction. But really the core of that is saying we'll decarbonise the electricity system, we'll make the electricity system bigger, and we'll use electricity to do everything we can. So we'll use electricity to power our cars, we'll use electricity where we can to power industry, we'll use electricity where we can to heat our homes, and if we do that as much as we can, we get to about an 80% reduction. So it's a story of decarbonising electricity and then kind of electrifying our economy, if you're right. It's got a bit of extra tree planting, and it's got a bit of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and it's got our first industrial carbon capture and storage cluster being formed in about 2040 to start to do carbon capture and storage on industrial emissions. And we can do all of that at carbon prices below about £20 a tonne of CO2, and actually the carbon price in Europe is now higher than that, so that makes absolute economic sense, and in an ideal world the market would just make that happen. Sadly, we don't live in a rational, ideal economic world, so that does need some government intervention to support making it happen. But even so, those are all very sensible things to do, and they're now extremely cost-effective. If not, actually, as with offshore wind, some of them actually make driving and using electricity in the UK potentially cheaper than it is today. But something very different happens when we now have to look at those 20% remaining emissions and say, how do we get rid of those? And the very different thing that appears in all of our scenarios is hydrogen. We can get to 80% without thinking about using hydrogen as an energy vector. But to get rid of those last 20% of emissions, almost every part of the economy needs hydrogen for something. So to get the very last out of our electricity emissions, we need to start burning hydrogen. For example, for peak lopping, for the evening peak when everybody gets home from work and puts the oven on, and we get a spike in electricity consumption. In buildings, we can mostly insulate our buildings really well and put in heat pumps, but some of our older buildings we can't insulate well enough for that to be really effective, and we will need to burn hydrogen alongside the heat pumps to heat water to go through the radiators. We can get most of our light-duty vehicles, our cars and vans, can be electric, but we don't think electric will work for heavy goods vehicles, so they will need hydrogen. In industry, we can electrify a certain amount, but sometimes we need very high-grade process heat, and actually it's better to do that with hydrogen. It's very inefficient to try and do that with electricity. So hydrogen starts to play a very, very important part. In addition, if we're going to make that hydrogen, we're probably going to make it from reforming of gas. So we're going to take methane, we're going to steam reform it, and we're going to produce hydrogen and CO2, and we're then going to need to capture and store that CO2. So an awful lot of that hydrogen will come from steam methane reforming of methane gas, basically. We're going to need to make some changes to agriculture and land use. We're going to need a lot of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage for negative emissions. We might need some direct air capture of carbon with carbon capture and storage, because we've still got all those aviation emissions that we're having to balance out, and therefore we're going to need a lot of carbon capture and storage. It also says we're going to be using a lot of fossil fuels in 2050. So, so here's the carbon capture and storage we may be doing on fossil fuels for electricity generation. That might be because we're burning hydrogen, or it might be post-combustion, but that's associated with electricity generation. Here is the carbon capture and storage on fossil fuels to produce hydrogen, so gas to hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. And here is the carbon capture and storage we need for fossil fuels being used in industry. So there's still a lot of fossil fuel in our net zero 2050 scenario, and that surprises some people. Why do we end up using hydrogen? Well, as well as trying to do this as cheaply as possible, we have always to be thinking about how do we use energy as efficiently as possible. And generally, the most efficient way to use energy, well, is to use as little of it as possible. So the first thing we need to do is have we made our processes as energy efficient as they can be. The second thing is, if we can use electricity directly, that's typically round about 90% efficient in terms of the electricity we generate and the energy we can actually use. However, as I've said, there are some things where we just, for various reasons, can't use electricity, and so then we look to hydrogen, and that's what we come to find we need to do in this 100% reduction scenario. You wouldn't use hydrogen if you could help it, because actually there are so many steps to using it that it's never as efficient as using the electricity directly. And then finally, and potentially in something like aviation, if we can't use electrification or hydrogen, we might turn to using synthetic fuels. But making synthetic fuels is hugely energy intensive, and it is therefore the last thing in most situations we would choose to do. Oops. So what are we using all this hydrogen for in 2050? Well, depending on how well we can insulate our homes, we might be using a lot of it. We might be using up to 200 terawatt hours of it in heating buildings. We're probably using almost 100 terawatt hours of it in transport for all sorts of heavy vehicles and in shipping in the form of ammonia, probably. We're using another 70 terawatt hours for high-grade heat in industry. We're probably using just a little bit in the power system, and that total comes to somewhere around perhaps 350 or so terawatt hours of hydrogen. 350 or so terawatt hours is the size of our current electricity system in terms of the energy it delivers. So this is about, between now and 2050, starting from scratch, developing a new industry the size of our current electricity system. That's a bit of a challenge. It's not technology that we don't know about. It's not stuff we can't do. It's just quite a lot of stuff to be getting on with. You'll notice that cars don't appear in that list of things we would be using hydrogen for, and this is why we assume we don't use hydrogen for cars. A petrol car is hugely inefficient. The energy stored in the oil, of that we use about 30% of it because of the inefficiency of the internal combustion engine, dominantly. There are other inefficiencies as well. If we have an electric vehicle and we've got nice low-carbon electricity, then in a battery in a car, we can convert 86% of that electricity we started with into the power for the car. If we go to a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, whether we make that hydrogen from electricity by the electrolysis of water or from natural gas by steam methane reforming with CCS, that already takes some 20% or something of the energy. We then have to compress the hydrogen. That reduces the energy by about another 10%. We then use a fuel cell, which may be 60 or so % efficient. So of the energy we started with, which might have been electricity, we only end up with, at best, about 45% of that energy used for propelling the car. So why would you waste all of that energy in having a hydrogen car if you could have an electric car which was twice as efficient? So I would need twice as many wind turbines to provide the electricity to power a hydrogen car as I do to provide the electricity to power an electric car. So it's a kind of no-brainer. It's going to be cheaper to have electric cars than hydrogen cars. Given that our last scenario only got us to 96% reduction, and given that we were asking our MPs, our Parliament, to legislate that we could reach 100%, we had to demonstrate to them that there were plenty of options left that could get us to 100%. So this is a pick and mix list. By the time we're looking for that last 4% of emissions reduction, we're having to look at things which are not such well-developed technologies. There's still things we know about. We're not expecting magic. We don't need unicorns to come romping in. But they probably have higher costs, or we find it hard to predict what their costs might be. And indeed, some of the things that we might need to do might not be publicly acceptable. Not publicly acceptable is easy. I can't imagine our government at the moment agreeing that it was going to introduce policies to tell people they had to eat 50% less meat. By 2040, they might be quite prepared to do that, but I don't think they are at the moment. And similarly, I don't think at the moment they would be prepared to tell people that you can't fly any more than you do today. So those are things that if we could have a bit of those, they will help us. We could vastly increase our afforestation. That sort of sounds easy, but actually remember the UK isn't very big. We don't actually have that much space. We could do a lot more bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, but we'd need to grow a lot more energy crops, which would need quite a lot more space. We could do a lot more direct air capture with carbon capture and storage, but we need a lot more CCS to do that, and we need a lot more electricity to do it with. So there are a whole range of things we could do, and you don't have to do all of them. They don't all have to work. They don't all have to come down to the kind of reasonable cost levels. But we just needed to be able to show there were scenarios that got us all the way down to 100%, to zero emissions, to 100% reduction, to assure our politicians that they weren't taking a huge risk. So, and they accepted that argument, and hopefully some of these will happen, but not all of them. The big message, however, to our politicians was deciding to change the target and change the legislation is a really easy thing to do. So don't feel too satisfied with yourselves for having done that. We're all very pleased you've done it. We'll give you a round of applause. But the work starts now, because now you've made the commitment, now we actually have to make the change. And making the change for us in the UK is really quite significant. Perhaps the biggest things we need to do first are this completion of the decarbonisation of our electricity system, and then we have to double it in size. We have to start a hydrogen industry from scratch. That not only means we have to put in some of the capital to start making hydrogen, it also means we have to stimulate the market, because there's no point in making hydrogen if nobody wants to buy it. And you're not going to get investors to start coming in after the government saying, oh yes, that's good, we'll invest in that, unless we've actually created a market with both supply and demand. So the government needs to be thinking, how does it stimulate both ends of that process? We've got 29 million homes in the UK that you couldn't currently heat with a heat pump and will still be with us in 2050. So we've got 29 million homes, all of which need to be got up to good levels of insulation or put onto heat networks in order that they can be ready for low carbon heat. So that's at least 1 million a year till 2050. We've got to really drive the electric vehicle market for cars and vans and decide what is going to be the solution for these heavy vehicles. Is it really going to be hydrogen? Because in 2030 to 2050, we'll have 20 years to turn over those fleets. We've got to start these initial carbon capture and storage clusters, where we look at industry clusters close to the offshore sites where we can store CO2, and we start thinking about what's the business model for getting them to capture CO2 and for putting it through pipes and storing it underground. So that's another industry we don't have a business model for. It needs to start, and it needs to be a sizable industry by the time we get to 2050. We've got lots of other things to do as well. There's a whole other slide of other things that the government needs to be thinking about. But obviously with a big focus here on the kind of infrastructural requirements we're going to need for these electric vehicles, the strengthening we're going to need for our electricity grids in order to cope with all of these new electricity demands, etc., etc., etc. So it's going to be quite difficult. The really good news is it isn't actually that expensive. So back in 2003, before the Committee on Climate Change existed, the government's own calculations in the Energy White Paper back then said that getting down to just 55% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 would cost up to 2% of GDP. When we were doing the original work for the Climate Change Act, looking at an 80% reduction, our calculations suggested it would cost 1 to 2% of GDP. So when our previous governments passed the Climate Change Act, implicit in accepting the target was that this could cost up to 2% of GDP. However, when we did the calculations for net zero, there's been so much progress in terms of reducing technology costs. We came up with this same range. It still only costs 1 to 2% of GDP. So we were able to say to our Parliament, you've already accepted implicitly this cost, this isn't going to cost you any more. And actually, because of the rate of reduction we're seeing in technology costs, we actually believe this is a significant overestimate. Indeed, if you take the example of electric vehicles, the government at the moment thinks that it is going for a 2040 switch over to electric vehicles. We're saying the government should bring that forward in the net zero scenario to 2035 or ideally 2030. And it's quite easy to demonstrate that it's actually cheaper to switch over to electric vehicles in 2030 than it is in 2040. So from a rational economic perspective, the government would be foolish not to make that change. The thing we try and persuade our governments not to do is short-term cost-benefit analysis, because we try and keep them focused on the fact the reason for doing this is about reducing the impacts of climate change, reducing the impacts of climate change for the UK, but globally, reducing the likelihood of flooding, the frequency of heat waves, the crop failures which could lead to enormous global famines, the prediction of hundreds of millions of climate migrants towards the end of the century if we don't come down from this trajectory of towards 3 to 4 degrees of warming. These are things where the costs are enormously high, and this is the real cost-benefit analysis of a small dent in our GDP. However, if you start looking at the short-term economic benefits, then the estimate of health benefits in the UK from cleaner air and more exercise are almost the cost of reaching net zero. If you start adding in economic opportunities from clean growth, and indeed the low-carbon goods and services has been the fastest growing sector of the UK economy since 2006. If you add in those opportunities, if you think about the quality of life from having these woodlands and more hedgerows and healthier wildlife, then actually it's not difficult to get up to a good reason to spend 1 to 2% of GDP. Oops. So let me come back to that thing I've kind of hinted at the moment. We've demonstrated that we can do this. We've demonstrated we can do it with existing technologies. We don't need unicorns. We don't need magic of any sort. We've demonstrated we can do this at a reasonable cost. And if you like to reflect on what the financial crisis caused by a few bankers investing in developing weird derivatives with very unsuitable investments, if you think about what that cost some of us globally, I mean, some people estimate that's had potentially a 10% impact on the UK's GDP on an ongoing basis, then this is a positive bargain. You know, if we let bankers do that, why on earth are we not charging ahead and doing this immediately? Because it's brilliant. So the thing we do need to reflect on is it's doable, it's affordable, but it's a heck of a lot to do, and it really does need focus. And the first point about it being a heck of a lot to do is it's doing all the stuff that governments don't like doing. So the things that our governments quite like doing are decarbonising electricity. That's this blue stuff, because the consumers don't even notice. And indeed, if that makes electricity cheaper, the consumers are going to be very happy. That's us. The things that are truly tough to do are persuading us to change our behaviour. They don't cost anything, but persuading us not to drive our cars when it's raining and to use the bicycle instead, persuading us to eat less meat. Those are really jolly difficult, and most governments prefer not to think about those at all. But even the things that are about a bit of technology but still need us to do different things in our homes, unfortunately, those now make up the majority of the stuff we've got to do. So persuading us that we need to have all that disruption to get our homes properly insulated and change our heating systems. Persuading us we'd really like to drive a different sort of car that we're not familiar with. And those are just the kind of measures that our governments hate, because they're about trying to do things that constrain personal freedom and things like that. And those are the areas where we find it most difficult to get the government to come up with really good policy measures. This stuff is really easy. Sadly, we've done quite a lot of that stuff already, and we really do need to get to these two bits. The other bit is just the scale of the challenge. So we've got 30 years. We've got to double the size of the electricity system. We've got an order of magnitude increase in the amount of offshore wind. We've got to start a hydrogen production industry that is going to be the size of our current electricity system. We've got to start a CCS industry that will go up to storing 180 megatons of CO2 per year by 2050. We've got to multiply by 5 the rate of afforestation. We've got 29 million homes to be installed with low carbon heat. Orders of magnitude increase in the number of electric cars on our roads, major changes in agricultural land use, and potentially even major changes to the diet of the people in the UK. All of these things are perfectly doable. History says we've done things on the scale of any one of those before in 30 years. History says we've done more than one of those in 30 years. But we've never done that in every sector of the economy all at once in 30 years. So that's the scale of the challenge. And if we're going to do it, we have to get started. Here's a cartoon that kind of tells our politicians what it is we're asking them to do. Here's our energy supply. It's about 50% green, about 50% based on gas, fossil fuels at the moment. We need to make it completely green, and then in order to use it in our houses, our cars, our heavy goods vehicles, and our factories, we need to double it in size. Our hydrogen industry is currently not green. It's very black indeed. We need to turn it green. We need to multiply it by 10. We need to use it in industry, in heavy goods vehicles, in our homes, and for electricity generation. We don't have any CO2 storage. We need to use it in industry. We need to use it in hydrogen production. We might need to use it in energy generation. We've got to do something about aviation. What we might need to do about aviation is plant lots of trees. So we're planting this many trees at the moment. We certainly need to be planting at least that many trees. And we don't have much space. We also need to be growing some bioenergy crops because we need some negative emissions to address the aviation emissions. And that means we need more carbon capture and storage. And if we're going to make space for growing those bioenergy crops and planting all those trees, then we're going to have to use much less space for producing lamb and beef. So that's going to need to shrink. And we might need to stop flying quite so much to try and shrink that as well so that it's balanced by the negative emissions. So that's the scale of transformation, all doable, but all needing to be done at once. So just a few final reflections. First of all, we don't have all the answers. There is plenty for our students in our universities who want to really make a difference to do. There's plenty of innovation and plenty of new research, and indeed maybe that last 4 or 5% will look completely different from how we think it will look at the moment. So there's plenty of fun to be had and plenty of challenges for our research community. There's still a lot of fossil fuel in 2050. We may not like it, we may think we want to get rid of it eventually, but there's still fossil fuel in 2050, we still need it. We can't entirely beat up the fossil fuel industry because we will need its help to get to 2050 and to do carbon capture and storage. Innovation has been brilliant in bringing costs down. Our governments need to continue to invest in it because we need to keep driving technologies down these cost reduction curves, and as we do, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to get lower and lower carbon. But we need to get going, and when Greta Thunberg came to the UK, she said, this needs cathedral thinking. Now, I was brought up as a very small child in a house near the close at Salisbury Cathedral, so I had endless stories about the building of Salisbury Cathedral. It took hundreds of years to build, The people who started building it knew roughly what it was going to look like, but they had no idea exactly how they would complete the roof. But it was a really important project, and they got started. And I think she captured it perfectly. That's what we need from our politicians. Thank you very much. I'll stand with you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Professor King, for this inspiring talk, which I think at the same time was very, very positive, ambitious, yet also realistic. I think, because I think, as you pointed out, the history time and time has been that the technological opportunities turn out better than we imagined them before we start. So we've got some questions, audience questions already on the screen. We'll get going with them. But also I would invite you to please indicate if you'd like to ask a question directly. We'll be very happy to do that. So please just indicate to me so we know where to send the mic. And if you don't mind, may I start off with a question?
Of course.
Okay. So you mentioned hydrogen a fair bit as an important component of a decarbonised energy and industrial system. And we tend to be quite excited about the prospects for hydrogen in Australia, but from the point of view of exporting hydrogen. And so the vision you laid out was for domestic production of hydrogen in the UK, gas steam reformation with carbon capture and storage. How about importing green hydrogen made on the basis of electrolysis with wind and solar from Australia?
We've looked at importing hydrogen, and everything tells us it will be more expensive than making it ourselves. We also in the UK see hydrogen as a potential export opportunity, not perhaps so much for the hydrogen itself, but because actually we have quite a lot of technology and companies who in the hydrogen space, and we see it as a potential area where we could be selling manufactured goods and plant to overseas countries. We also see that there might be a role for us in supplying hydrogen to countries like France and Germany, because we have an enormous amount of CO2 storage capability all around the UK, estimated at hundreds of years' worth. France and Germany don't, and so there is the possibility that we could be making hydrogen and shipping it to them because they're not very far away and it's easier to transport it if you don't have to take it too far. So we certainly do see hydrogen as a real opportunity in the UK. We see it as an export opportunity, but more for the equipment and the facilities where we think we have some sort of cutting-edge technology, rather really than probably exporting the hydrogen itself. But who knows, that might be a possibility. On the Committee on Climate Change, our role is not to look at what the UK's future exports might be, but it is to flag up whether there are opportunities for the UK in some of these areas. But we are also getting excited about hydrogen. I think we're probably safely far enough apart that we're not going to be treading on each other's toes too much in terms of getting excited about hydrogen.
Maybe the two countries will find themselves competing.
Collaboration rather than competition would be good.
That's right. Or it may end up competition in continental European markets.
It could be, yes.
Who knows? Okay. Can I invite questions from the audience? I see a hand up just here, just next to the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for that. I have a question just around population growth. Clearly that's going to impact the modelling. And I guess I just want to understand, what your thinking is in relation to that. Clearly that's a behaviour that is going to be a challenge to consider going forward, but is obviously going to have a great impact.
We haven't seen the huge population growth that you've seen in Australia in the UK. In fact, population growth in the UK is very slow. It's been slightly higher amongst our EU, the non-UK EU members of our community. So Brexit may actually slow it down even further if some of them decide to go back. So it isn't a huge swinger for us. Wherever we can, we use the government's own projections for things like that so that we're not out of line with analysis the government would do. So we don't do a lot of work of our own on population growth predictions because the government does its own, and we say, fine, if that's what you think it'll be, we'll base our need to decarbonise on the number of people you think we'll have in the UK. So it's not a very rapid growth in population. It certainly isn't the sort of rapid growth you've seen in parts of Australia.
Let me move to the questions on the screen. So you also have the opportunity, if you have this on your gadget, to vote questions up and maybe down as well, Juliet? Up, only up. Okay. And the question that has been most upvoted so far is by Jacob, who's asking, what measures are there within the UK strategy to persuade some other countries, like Australia, to rise, some more lethargic countries, to rise to the challenge? So I think your report mentions quite prominently the role as a global leader that the UK arguably already has and should pursue in the future.
Well, I understand some of our ministers have already visited Australia to talk to yours, to encourage them about this. We are also certainly hoping to take the opportunity of hosting the COP meeting in Glasgow in the end of November 2020 to politely embarrass some of our friends and some of our neighbours as well into upping their game a bit, and hopefully by telling some of the stories of success that we have had. We have, in the offshore wind sector, and not suggesting that it's necessarily the sector that Australia should be investing in, but in the offshore wind sector, we now have a sector deal between the offshore wind industry and the UK government. The UK government has committed to making it clear how much offshore wind it will pay for. Actually, the offshore wind is going to be paying the UK government from the late 2020s onwards, because it'll be coming in below the electricity price. But it's said that there will be an auction for new offshore wind capacity every 2 years between now and 2030 to build up to 30 gigawatts and potentially more of offshore wind. And with the industry having seen that certainty and that certainty of industrial growth, have committed to the UK government that they will aim for 60% UK content in every new offshore wind project. That's a huge win for UK jobs. That's huge inward investment to the UK, building blade factories. It's particularly important investment for the UK because it's in many of our very deprived coastal communities where the offshore wind farms are actually offshore, from places like Hull and Grimsby up in the northeast, places like the Solent down around the south of the UK. So these are brilliant opportunities for politicians. There's nothing politicians like better to point out about how they're creating jobs, to cut the ribbons on new factories. So it's been this has been a real success story. And it's a success story despite the fact we don't have any original equipment manufacturers in the offshore wind area in the UK. We don't have any UK offshore wind developers. So this is all being done by overseas companies, and yet it is bringing huge amounts of investment and large numbers of jobs to the UK. If we can do the same with hydrogen, actually, because we have real intellectual property and we have some really big companies in the UK who can produce hydrogen, who produce catalysts, a small but rapidly growing company that produces new kinds of electrolyzers. Actually, hydrogen in the UK could be an even bigger success story than that. So these are the kind of stories. This is the story of what we call clean growth, which now forms the core of the UK's industrial strategy.
And there are, of course, very direct parallels with the Australian situation. I think in your talk you mentioned that the latest contracts for difference came in at about £40 per megawatt hour.
Less than 40, £39.50. It's very important.
Right. So the contracts for difference that we know about in Australia come in at about 40% below that, even, I think, for onshore wind and solar. And the story with coal-fired power stations is also relatively similar. Quite a number of aging stations that are closing. So the public discourse, however, about employment, and there's a question up on the screen about employment as well, that public discourse has been much more regarding the downside than the upside in Australia. So we tend to discuss a lot more the potential problems that will arise from the closure of fossil fuel assets, in particular regions where they are concentrated, than the upside in renewables. So it'd be great to hear more about your committee's deliberations on that.
One of the things that we did in making our recommendations on net zero to the government was to say the Treasury needs to look at where the costs of the transition will fall. Because although the costs of the transition aren't terribly high, they're very unevenly distributed. So because the costs, a big chunk of the cost, more than half of the cost, is actually the cost of decarbonising heat, if nothing is done about it, it will fall very much on, for example, for the fuel poor, who are people who spend a disproportionately large proportion of their salary on heating their homes. So, you know, classically it's the elderly lady in the big drafty house who can't afford to do the insulation, so she's burning enormous amounts of gas. They will fall disproportionately on the industries that are very energy intensive and where they're swapping methane for hydrogen, for example. So we have quite a significant revival in our ceramics and our brickmaking industry in the UK. It could be pretty devastating for that industry if they have to bear all of the costs of the change. However, if you look at the energy sector in the UK, and if you look at energy prices, it is absolutely riddled with taxes and incentives that over many, many years, many governments have applied to different bits of our energy system. So we've said to the Treasury, you need to stand back from this and say, look, how do you unpick all of this complex array of taxes and subsidies and put them back in so that the old lady who needs to heat her big house doesn't find she can't afford to eat, and so that we don't export any more of our industrial emissions by losing the industries like our resurgent ceramics industry or the remains of our steel industry or indeed, you know, the other key industries in some of these areas. However, nevertheless, there will be industries that will be in decline, and our oil industry will be in decline. But actually, the people who make things for offshore oil rigs, or indeed who charter vessels or who work on offshore oil rigs, there are not dissimilar jobs that are required in the offshore wind industry. So it's a matter of looking at how do we make sure we have training programs in place for these people, how do we make sure there are programs to help the steel fabricators who've traditionally worked in the offshore industry to turn their skills and their designs to be doing steel fabrication for offshore wind farms. There are going to be enormous numbers of jobs in the building industry, improving the quality of these 29 million homes and installing heat pumps and potentially hybrid heat pump hydrogen boilers and things. Those are going to be really highly skilled, good jobs. And by the time we've spent 30 years putting all of those into a new set of houses, actually they'll all need replacing again. So they're not jobs that we need for 30 years and will then disappear. These are ongoing jobs that we're going to need. So it's a matter of sort of highlighting where the new jobs are going to come and where the old jobs are going to be disappearing, and thinking about how do we ensure that, that we make sure the population has the skills to take them on. We see this as about growth, and growth is about more jobs, not less jobs. And I think I've done quite a bit of talking to our trade unions. Our trade union congress has a just transition plan, which they've talked to us about, which picks up on some of these issues and sort of says to the government what they would like to see and what the trade union movement can do in support of this.
I think I saw a hand up in that corner over here. Was I mistaken? Great.
Yeah, one of your countrymen, Richard Branson, flew one of his planes from Britain to Australia last year entirely on bioavgas. It's just like kerosene, but you make it from a marine algae. Now, nobody at the CSIRO who was around in the mid-1970s would have been surprised at that. The Australian government here asked the CSIRO to produce a report on alternatives to fossil fuels in the wake of the Arab oil crisis in '73, and that report recommended the use of precisely that form of bioavgas to run the world's aviation. They recommended that all internal combustion engines could be run on either ethanol or biodiesel, that even ships, there were biofuel alternatives to that awful bunker fuel. Why does that not figure anywhere in your plan?
Because we're exceedingly logical and a bunch of technocrats, and all of the IPCC scenarios point out that we need enormous amounts of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to generate negative emissions. So basically, because bioenergy is so precious in all of the scenarios that get us to 1.5 degrees, that we can't afford to burn it anywhere where it's allowed to release CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. We need to be using it, ideally, in applications where we're capturing that CO2 and sequestering it, because then we get net negative emissions. So yes, as an interim measure, we have some biodiesel in our diesel in the UK, and there is some level of biokerosene in jet fuel in the UK. But we see that as a temporary measure, which slightly reduces the emissions from those. But we don't see it as the best use at the moment, as for the amount of resource that the world can conceivably produce of bioenergy. Now, things may change between now and 2050. We may find ways of producing bioenergy resource that doesn't require very much space. As you say, some of the algal methods might demonstrate that we can do them in a much larger scale than we think we can do them at the moment, and so that may become more possible. But I rather suspect we will still be desperate for those negative emissions. So the logical thing to do with them is to put them into energy generation with carbon capture and storage, or hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage. And that's why you don't see them appearing, particularly when you look at how inefficient internal combustion engines are in cars. You really don't want to put anything through an internal combustion engine if you can avoid it.
Perhaps for conversation over drinks, but we speak increasingly with colleagues who are quite optimistic about the prospect of aviation fuel on the basis of synthetic zero emissions hydrogen and up the fuel chain.
We have synthetic fuels as a possibility in our 0%, but the implications for the UK use of aviation fuel, if it were to be produced by synthetic fuels, would be that we would need another 33% increase in the size of our electricity generating system.
Yeah. Hence, you will import it from Australia.
Those are the kind of balances that we have to take. You know, we're already doubling it in size, possibly further towards 4 times the size. Can we afford another 33% growth, or indeed can we fit it in that timescale? So yes, synthetic fuels are interesting. We're really pleased to see people doing research on them and thinking about how they might be used, but we really do need to keep in mind the energy intensity of them.
While, of course, currently the kerosene burned in British airplanes is not oil that is extracted in Britain, I'm guessing.
And in terms of, you know, the bizarre collection of incentives and taxes we have in the energy system, the kerosene burned in British aircraft is tax-free. Which is shocking, really.
As it is in Australian aircraft. Let's come back to some questions. And the most upvoted question at this point on the screen is, what merit does non-violent civil disobedience have as a means of achieving change in Australia or indeed other countries? And I guess what we're talking about is a growing movement that we see in many European countries, not sure in the UK, in terms of extinction rebellion and so forth, and the reverberations that has with governments. Can you speculate as to the mindset of the UK Parliament and government in adopting a net zero target, and how that is related to technical advice versus the expressed will of a perhaps large segment of the population?
I think at around the time we launched our report on net zero, coming up to its launch, not planned by us, We had big Extinction Rebellion protests in blocking streets in central London. We had Greta Thunberg's visit. We had a lot of school strike activity in the UK. And that actually, all of that was hugely productive in terms of raising awareness and really putting politicians on the spot about the fact that the public was really concerned about this. And the good thing about the Extinction Rebellion protests at that time was that they were 99.999% incredibly peaceful, incredibly friendly. They were handing out leaflets to people apologising for the inconvenience they were causing. When they left the various parts of central London where they'd been camping, they cleaned up after themselves and picked up all the litter. And, you know, we've never had protesters like that before. So everybody thought that was really quite special. We have them in central London again at the moment. And this time they are causing a greater level of irritation to people. And I think it's, you know, they need to be thinking about how do they maintain kind of that really positive spirit that they created in those first demonstrations, because they did create a very warm, positive spirit, and the public responded very well to them. The public is not responding quite so positively this time. The school strikes, I think, have been brilliant, have been raising parents' awareness. There have been lots of, they've had some the kids have had some marches certainly through London, and office workers have been coming out and clapping them and things. So I think that has been received very, very well by the public. It's actually much less disruptive to the public generally in the UK. And I think that has been a really good reminder that, you know, this is an issue that young people care about. And the political parties in the UK are very concerned about what young people care about, because the Conservative Party particularly knows that its supporter base is getting quite elderly. The average age of its members is something like 62 or 63, and it needs policies that appeal to young people. We also know that in the UK, young people traditionally haven't been coming out to vote, but actually are now increasingly becoming politically active again. And so they are becoming a significant political force. I mean, unfortunately, people over 60 are much more likely to vote than anybody else in the UK. So it's great to have the views of the future rather than people like me who in some ways are the views of the past. You know? So I think that, you know, the politicians are becoming more and more aware of the role of the young and the importance of the young, particularly as there's this move to the young voting again, which they haven't been doing for a while.
There remains much to be discussed. There's many questions that are still to be asked and answered. So I'd really encourage you to stay here for another 20 minutes, half an hour, and grab the opportunity to ask Professor King and to engage in that discussion. Thank you all for coming. I hope it was as enlightening, as enjoyable an evening as it has been for me. And let's thank Professor King for the great talk.